morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking a moment to silence your cell phones and to give your undivided attention to today's speaker. Here to introduce today's speaker is Remy Lewis.
Good morning, everyone. From the first time I met Peyton, I learned how passionate she is about anything she sets her mind to or believes in. Her and I have had many heated discussions about the roles of women, politics, and the transgender movement. The impact of the transgender movement is a controversial subject that likely brings strong opinions and often avoidance for many of us in this room. That is why I'm so inspired by Peyton's courage to speak about this topic. So open your minds, because there's truly no one better to share their position on how the transgender movement has negatively impacted women in society than my friend Peyton Greer. Why do women have separate spaces from men in society? In order to answer this question, we must first know what a woman is. A woman is a person with two X chromosomes, while a man is a person with X and Y chromosomes. A man's Y chromosome is what causes them to produce 30 times more testosterone than women after puberty, which is one of the many physical advantages that men have over women, meaning it is necessary for their separation in athletic competitions. Secondly, according to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, 1 in 5 of all women experience some sort of sexual assault or harassment in their lifetime, which is why it is so important for women to feel comfortable in their restrooms, dorms, changing areas, and other spaces. Women's spaces are incredibly important to the safety and success of women in society, and due to the newly pushed transgender movement, women's Title IX rights are being challenged, along with their place in sports and safe spaces in society. When taking a look at the history of women and where they stood in society, it is evident that only in the past century have women started to gain the same opportunities as men. Before the benefits of the creation of Title IX, which was passed into law on June 23, 1972, women participating in sports or any athletic competition was heavily looked down upon. Women were viewed as weak or frail, and there was belief that strenuous activities could harm their reproductive organs, making them unattractive to men. This backlash from men persisted all throughout the creation of Title IX. Most of this backlash stemmed from a fear among men that the increased importance and relevance of women's sports would lead to a decrease in the amount of money that was being spent on men's sports. When Title IX was passed in 1972, it stated that no person in the United States shall on the basis of sex be excluded from participation in, be denied benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, along with the importance of preventing sex-based harassment for women. Title IX's laws were unchanging until the Biden administration in 2021 began undoing the protections that Trump had in place for the security of Title IX. President Biden issued Executive Order 14021 to, quote, begin undoing the Trump administration's harmful actions undermining Title IX and protections for LGBTQ+ students and sexual assault survivors, end quote. Biden's executive order changed the Title IX final rule definition of sex-based harassment to include harassment based on sex characteristics, sexual orientation, gender identity, sex stereotypes, and pregnancy. With the inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity into Title IX, it allows for a gray area surrounding what a woman is and who is allowed into their spaces in athletics. This expansion of Title IX final rule gives women no choice but to accept the integration of biological men into women's spaces if they claim to be identifying as a woman. Although these spaces for women have been threatened, they have not been completely lost. When President Trump was reelected in 2024, he signed an executive order based on Title IX that was titled Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports. This order forewarned the withholding of federal funding from educational institutions that permit transgender women and girls to compete in women's sports. This would seem like a fix-all for the occurring problem of biological men in women's areas, but even with the new law in place and the taking away of federal funding, some schools choose to lose federal funding in order to keep these transgender women in biological women's spaces. Loudoun, Fairfax, Arlington, Alexandria, and Prince William County are 5 counties that refuse to abide by the original Title IX rule just in Virginia. All of these counties have been found in violation of Title IX for their policies which allow for students to use restrooms and changing rooms based on gender identity instead of biological sex. These counties are considered to be at high risk within the federal grant system for blatantly violating the law. These counties justify their actions by claiming that allowing men who identify as women To use biological women's intimate areas is what they must do in order to create a safe and welcoming environment for all students. Meanwhile, in Loudoun County, Virginia, at Stonebridge High School, a transgender student sexually assaulted a girl classmate inside a restroom of May of 2021. He was then transferred to a different school for the next school year, where he assaulted another girl in October of 2021. The parents of the first victim filed a $30 million lawsuit against the Northern Virginia school system. The parents claimed that the district failed to adequately investigate the incident and tried to cover up the assault. The Loudoun County Sheriff's Office had directed the school to hold off on starting a Title IX investigation, even though the school was legally obligated to. In Fairfax County, there was an incident where a sophomore boy, who according to the school identified as female, went into the girls' locker room multiple times while students were changing. While this raised many concerns from parents and students, Fairfax County Public Schools said they were unable to prevent this from happening because of the district policy. This same policy is followed in Temecula Valley Unified School District in California, where at James L. Day Middle School, students, parents, and faculty members have walked out in protest. In response to these protests, the board created outs for these girls, where if they file for religious belief or mental health accommodations, they are allowed to change in a private restroom. In this mental health accommodation, these girls have to label themselves as anxious or sick in order to avoid changing in the same space as someone of the opposite sex. Women and young girls should not have to label themselves as mentally ill for feeling uncomfortable changing in areas with a biological man. Even though not every transgender woman comes into a woman's bathroom with the intent of causing harm, biological men should not be allowed access to women's intimate spaces. In these counties that are not following Title IX, all it takes for a man to have access to a woman's space is to say he identifies as one. Some believe that this issue is irrelevant due to the fact that only around 2.8 million people in the U.S. above the age of 13 identify themselves with transgender, making up only 1% of the total population, while women make up about 50% of the population. Since this is the case, why are we allowing such a small percentage of people to completely rewrite the rules that have been created for the safety of women and permit them to negatively impact so many? In a study done by the National News Desk, they state that almost 900 transgender athletes competing in women's competition have won over their competitors. They also state that over 600 female athletes have lost at least 890 medals to transgender competitors, which occurred over 400 competitions in 29 sports. The reasons transgender athletes are able to take these titles and have such an advantage is mainly due to the multiple physical advantages that biological men have over women, including having more dense bones, ligaments, and tendons, having on average increased muscle mass, quicker muscle twitch fibers, while also having genetically larger hearts and lungs. There are two types of muscle fibers, including type 1, otherwise known as slow twitch, and type 2, known as fast twitch. Type 2 fibers are more efficient than type 1 fibers at using oxygen to create energy, which is ideal in endurance exercise. Type 2 fibers have a 10 to 20% greater contractile force, which is the strength a muscle generates during contraction, allowing it to shorten and perform work. These type 2 fibers that allow for enhanced performance in sprinting or high force movements are predominantly found in men, while women have more of the type 1 fiber. Another difference is heart size. While women's hearts are 1/4 the size of a man's heart, meaning on average, a woman's heart weighs 26% less than a man's heart. Since men have larger hearts, this allows for increased cardiac output and increased stroke volume, which is the amount of blood pumped per beat, allowing for increased oxygen intake and endurance. Men also have larger bones along with greater bone stability that allows for protection of their ligaments and tendons. Overall, women only have, on average, 52% of the upper body strength and 66% of the lower body strength when compared to the average man. All of these differences are examples of why men and women are biologically very different. Despite the intake of hormone therapy, none of these differences can be completely altered to create equal competition between men and women. When interviewed about biological women losing to transgender athletes, Roanoke City Councilman Peter Velosin stated that if you are a woman who loses to a transgender athlete, quote, you should just be training harder, period, end quote. No matter how hard a woman trains, she cannot overcompensate for the physical advantages that men hold. For example, men are naturally accustomed with testosterone, which is the performance-enhancing drug that women are tested for when participating in athletic competition. So the drug that women would have to take in order to perform better is the natural hormone that men are accustomed with. We can see this come into effect just by looking at the difference in stats in their sports. For example, in the history of the WNBA, only 8 women have ever dunked a basketball, and each of these women have a combined number of 37 dunks, while in the NBA, there is on average 10 to 15 dunks per game. Another study found that the average male has 160% greater punching power in comparison to the punching power of a woman. For example, in Olympic boxing, Amin Khalif competed in the women's middleweight division. Khalif presents as a woman but has XY chromosomes. When attempting to compete in 2023, she was disqualified after failing a gender eligibility test, but was later able to compete in 2024 after the Olympics allowed for people to participate in the category that they identified with. In her opening match, she was competing against Angela Carini, who quit after 46 seconds, after saying she felt severe pain in her nose and that she could not finish the match. Khalif later went on to win the gold medal in the women's division. Another example of this is Peyton McNabb. Peyton McNabb was 17 when she was faced with life-changing injuries after competing against a transgender woman in women's volleyball. During a high school volleyball match, the transgender opponent hit the ball into McNabb's head, which left her unconscious for 30 seconds. She sustained multiple injuries such as concussion, neck damage, and 2 black eyes. Later on, she was diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury, a brain bleed, partial paralysis, and loss of peripheral vision on her right side. She was crippled with increased memory loss, headaches, and confusion. When comparing the differences between men and women's volleyball, we can observe major differences. For example, the official net height for women's volleyball is 7 feet 4 inches, while the official net height for men's volleyball is 7 feet 11 inches, meaning that the women's volleyball net is around 7.5 inches shorter than the men's net. The reason for this net difference is because on average, men volleyball players are 8 inches taller and can jump over 6 inches higher than women volleyball players. Along with this, there is a strong difference between the strength used to hit the ball. The record for men volleyball players when hitting the ball is 82 miles per hour, while for women this record is 64 miles per hour, meaning that men are able to hit the ball almost 30% faster. McNabb went on to later state that, quote, "It was 100% avoidable if only my rights as a female athlete had been more important than a man's feelings," end quote. When discussing the event that happened to McNabb, Representative Lisa McLean asked the president of the National Women's Law Center, Fatina Goss-Graves, if she believed that McNabb was safe during that volleyball game. Graves responded and said, quote, "It sounded like she most definitely wasn't. What happened to her was tragic. But I would argue, though, that the answer is that people cannot spike volleyballs into people's heads. That seems unsafe," end quote. This is the president of the National Women's Law Center, who is promoting the removal of hitting the ball in volleyball instead of the removal of biological men from women's athletics. Controversies like these have led to many protests among women, ranging from protests against the sharing of intimate spaces, but also protests against competing against a transgender woman. Multiple women's athletics teams have refused to play teams with transgender women on them. On the San Jose State University women's volleyball team, a transgender woman named Blair Fleming joined the team. 5 teams have since forfeited from competition against SJSU, including Southern Utah, Boise State forfeited twice, Utah State, Wyoming, and Nevada. Along with the forfeits of other teams, multiple of Fleming's fellow teammates transferred off the team after their season together ended in December. Multiple of these teammates and the former assistant coach also joined a lawsuit talking about their experience with Fleming. In a lawsuit filed by teammate Brooke Slusher, she states that SJSU hid information regarding Fleming's birth sex, while Slusher and Fleming were repeatedly roomed together on overnight trips. All over the country, women are forfeiting games in order not to have to play against these transgender athletes, not only because of the risk of safety, but competing against a transgender athlete can end up to the loss of scholarships, records, and other athletic achievements. For example, trans athletes Terry Miller and Andrea Yearwood participated in the women's division of a track and field championship in Connecticut. Combined, they both won 15 state championships and broke 17 meet records from 2017 through 2020. Each of these titles won by a transgender athlete could be a title going to a biological woman, which could eventually help young women be able to play sports at the collegiate level. In conclusion, women have fought for equal rights for over the past century, and with the heavily pushed transgender movement, these rights are being challenged. The transgender movement has led to institutions going against Title IX and allowing the integration of biological men into women's intimate spaces in sports. Not only does this take away from opportunities from women, it can also lead to women feeling unsafe and vulnerable in vulnerable environments that should be comfortable. The reasons for transgender women's inclusion into these spaces is for the creation of a safe environment for everyone, but actively goes against safe environments made for women. Along with this, men and women are too biologically different for fair athletic competition between them. Despite the intake of hormone therapy and other drugs, men have a biological advantage that cannot be changed to create fair competition. Overall, women need to be protected, including their spaces such as women's bathrooms, locker rooms, and sports. Women's rights and safety should not be rewritten, ignored, or taken away for the comfort of 1% of the population. And women athletes work way too hard for their titles and opportunities to be taken away by biological men. Thank you.